Today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show, we have some interesting bits of news that is coming around, including talk about the D&D Player's Handbook. A lot more information we're going to get next week. The Shadowdark Solodark video that Kelsey Dionne did. I want to talk about an excellent podcast that I have been listening to called When We Were Wizards, about the history, the sordid history of TSR. We're going to look at the Backerkit we're going to look at the crowdfunding campaign for Nimble 5e and what that means. I'm going to talk about my experiences this past weekend playing Pirate Borg, Blade Runner, and Dragon, all at a local game convention that I really enjoyed. Today's big topic is going to be dealing with morality in role-playing games. This is something that I thought a lot about while I was playing some of my games at this local convention. And we're going to cover more questions from the July 2024 Patreon Q&A, all today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show. I'm Mike Shea, your pal from Sly Flourish, here to talk about all things in tabletop role-playing games. This show is brought to you by the awesome patrons of Sly Flourish. Patrons of Sly Flourish get access to all kinds of tools and previews and adventures and stuff to help you run your game, and you get access to the awesome Lazy DM community over on Discord. And you help me put on shows like this. To the patrons of Sly Flourish, thank you so much for your support. As you can see from the cover over on the other side, next week, a week from Tuesday, on August 6th, we are going to be launching the Kickstarter campaign for my latest book, The City of Arches. The City of Arches is a high fantasy city source book for lazy DMs. It is built to run with pretty much any fantasy role-playing game, a little bit of a focus on 5e, but any of the flavors of 5e, including 2024 D&D, 2014 D&D, Level Up Advanced to 5e, Tales of the Valiant, and pretty much any other fantasy role-playing game. It will work. It's very mechanics light, very heavy on information to help you run awesome campaigns. This has been a book that's been going on for 2 years. I've been working on it for 2 years. Patrons have seen it grow from just a quick 16-page PDF idea into a 160-page full-color hardcover and PDF that we are going to be funding on Kickstarter. If you like the work that I do, please consider following in the links below to the Kickstarter preview page where you can be notified on the launch of the preview. Please tell your friends about it. Tell your other Game Master friends about it. And when it goes live, you will have access to a 42-page preview that includes an introduction scenario, an adventure, and tons of information to show you what this book is all about. I think you're going to love it, and I really hope you will back my project. Next week, my understanding, so a couple of things are happening. Big things are happening. One of the big things that's happening is that they are going to be releasing, I think, 3,000-ish copies of the 2024 D&D Player's Handbook at Gen Con. And my understanding is that people who have had the book or are getting the book can start talking all about it and actually showing stuff that's in the book on August 1st. So all of your questions about Heroes Feast, I know you, like me, I'm sure everybody in the community, the whole D&D community, certainly has been asking the question of, what are you going to do about Heroes Feast and the poison immunity? Are you going to do something about that? We will all find out. I'm the only one in the world who cares, but I do care, and I'm curious to see. We will all be able to find out all of our questions about the D&D 2024 Player's Handbook on August 1st. So that's going to be pretty cool. I'm sure there'll be lots of videos, lots of shock-face videos. Oh my God, can you believe what they did? But a lot of us will have access to it. A lot of people will be able to look into the book and actually see what we've got. So that's going to be an interesting thing coming up next week. Not really much point in talking about it now because we're all going to know all the answers in a week. Shadowdark. So I had already talked about the Solodark rules that Kelsey Dionne had written up for Shadowdark. You can download them for free from the Shadowdark website. You can also pick up a physical version. I'm cheap, so I didn't buy a physical version, but I plan to probably add a physical version in as soon as I can also buy other stuff. Like I have heard rumors that Cursed Scroll 4, 5, and 6 are coming out. So when I can buy more stuff and save a little bit on shipping, I plan to order a physical version. But you can download the PDF right away. It's a short guide. It has some really cool stuff. But what is particularly interesting, and Kelsey had made a promise about this on the Kickstarter, that she was going to do a Solodark video, and she did so. So she has a Shadowdark Solodark episode, 17 minutes long, where she shows how she uses the Oracle, how she goes through the process, how she uses these books together to come up with her own campaign, her own solo campaign in Shadowdark. I think it is a really cool way to play the game, to enjoy it. Maybe if you don't know who you're going to run Shadowdark with and you just want to try it out, this is a good way to do it. But I really think that this kind of solo play is really good cross-training for game mastering. I found this out when I was playing some Ironsworn, solo Ironsworn. And I found that like if you really want to, if you find yourself with extra time on your hands and you're like, I'd like to kind of stretch my GM muscles, it is a fantastic way, especially with an Oracle, which kind of makes you have to think about what's going on in the story. And it's like you and a die are kind of figuring out how the story goes. It's a great way to improvise. It's a great way to stretch your improvisation muscles. And that's stuff that you can directly use when you're running your own game with your other players as well. Kind of learning about what a die roll means and how the story can shift and turn and bob and weave is really good. So I think not only is it fun to play like a solo RPG and something like Shadowdark with the Solodark rules, but it is really good cross-training for game mastering because it helps you sort of take mechanical die rolls and turn them into elements of how the story shifts and changes. So that's really cool. You can find links to Kelsey's video and to the Solodark rules in the show notes below. I am not normally one who cares very much about the history of role-playing games. I am more interested in what is happening now. I'm curious about like now and in the future what happens. To me, like the history is just the history. We can learn from it, but like the world is changing pretty rapidly anyway. So I wasn't really one of the people who was like, oh, I really care about the knowing where D&D came from and how it came about and what it was like and all of that. It's fine. Like I'm not against it. But then I started listening to this podcast called When We Were Wizards. And it is an extremely professional podcast where they interview tons of people who were there at the beginnings of TSR, at the beginnings of Dungeons & Dragons. Obviously, the two creators of Dungeons & Dragons have now both passed on. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson are both gone, as are others. But there are many other people who were there at the time who can talk about what really happened. It is a really well put together podcast, very professional, lots of readings of court material, lots of readings of memos that were sent around, lots of like actual evidence of the things that were going on, and one-on-one interviews with many of the people who were there that talk about the history of TSR, where it came from, what it was like, all the kind of stuff that happened. I will warn you, and some folks on our Sly Flourish Discord server brought this up, it is scandalous. It is a bit tabloid. So if you don't really want to kind of like dive into the dirt, this is not the podcast for you because there is tons of dirt. One thing, and I'm going to talk about like the main things that I learned from this podcast so far. A new episode just dropped today that I just started listening to, and I binge listened to this whole thing. There wasn't a free moment of time where I didn't like I wanted to follow the next thing. I was like, it is a hell of a story of what is going on. And I had some things that I learned that I didn't know when I listened to this podcast. One of the things I didn't know was that TSR management was a disaster pretty much from day one. That the minute the company started to become a company, things were already screwed up. There was already like infighting. There was already like weird mismanagement stuff going on. And the only thing that seemed to keep this whole thing going is the fact that D&D was as strong as it was, that D&D was really good. And it was obviously something very important and totally brand new. And my life is forever changed by it, and the lives of many people are forever changed by it. The podcast doesn't get into that. It says like, hey, millions of people are playing it now, and it transformed everything from like health apps to video games, or all can kind of tie their roots back to D&D. But it's focusing on like what really happened at the company, and more so than like what the game itself means. And other than the fact that the game was as strong as it was, boy, the management of it was screwed up almost from the very beginning. That's something I didn't know, because I had always heard like, oh, TSR was doing whatever it was doing, and then Lorraine Williams took over, and then it was a total shit show, and then it went bankrupt, and then Wizards of the Coast bailed them out. Right? That's the kind of story I'd heard. It's pretty clear that you can't point it at Lorraine Williams for hosing it up. It was pretty hosed up for many, many years before things that went on. And so I found it really, really fascinating. So TSR management was a disaster from the very beginning. No one comes out unscathed except for many of the line level designers. And it could be because the line level designers are the ones who are doing the interviews. So there's probably lots of like things that were going on with the line level designers as well. Most of the time they just talk about the fact that they loved what they did, but they were highly underpaid. Anybody in ownership or management, anyone who was like kind of a shareholder of it, nobody comes out unscathed from like Gary Gygax's initial life kind of, being like tormenting his family or not tormenting, but like dominating over his family, like my way or the highway. I'm going to do what I want to do. I don't care how many kids we have, and kind of abandoning time with his family in order to kind of pursue this passion. I learned that his wife, Gail, let the cats go poop in his sand table, his wargaming sand table, when she was mad at him. That's the kind of thing you're going to learn about when you listen to this podcast. So no one really comes out unscathed. The idea that Dave Arneson was kind of one of the main drivers that actually created D&D, but was also a terrible, terrible writer. And like the amount of editing that they had to do on his work was really, really high. That's something that comes out. So that's a big one. One other thing that I learned is that in many cases, the products that we love and that we adore came specifically from business manipulation, not creative energy. And the big example is AD&D. I'm probably naive in this. There's probably other people that knew this already. I mentioned it with some industry friends of mine, and they're like, yeah, like you didn't know that? I'm like, no, I didn't know that. I don't pay attention to the history. The only reason Advanced Dungeons & Dragons existed was because Gary Gygax didn't want to pay royalties to Dave Arneson for D&D Basic. So he made a new version of D&D that he wrote himself and did not put Dave Arneson's name in it in order to not have to pay royalties to Dave Arneson for a new version of D&D, because he was paying so much in royalties. This also comes around later, but I didn't know that. Like the reason AD&D exists isn't because they were like, oh, we need a new version of D&D that's more solid or tightens up the rules or whatever. It's like, no, Gary didn't want to pay royalties to Dave Arneson, so he made a new version of D&D. That's one of them. There was another example later on where I can't remember who wrote it, but one of the designers wrote a intro adventure for the D&D Red Box Basic set called B1. And it sold so well, and they were giving royalties to the writers. In Search of the Unknown, B1 is the B1 adventure. B1 was written by Mike Carr, who was it did very, very well. It did so well that Gary was not crazy about the fact that it was doing as well as it was. So he wrote B2 and then replaced B1 with B2 so he would get the royalties. So in many cases, Gary was getting direct royalties for the products that he was creating for TSR himself. And it sold so well that Gary was jealous of the fact that this guy was getting all of these royalties. So he wrote B2, which is Keep of the Borderlands, and basically delisted B1 so that his one would be coming out and be more popular and he would get the royalties for it. So the drive of a lot of the things that we know about, like everybody remembers Keep of the Borderlands. Not a lot of people, including me, remember what B1 was. Yeah, it's good, but it was also built as a business decision, not because, there was like, oh, there's a new creative drive for a new thing. So that was something that I learned. Another one that's really interesting, and comes across in the podcast throughout the entire podcast, is the fact that like Gary Gygax was basically quadruple dipping into the company. He was a company owner, which meant he would get profits based on what the company's profits would be. Like he was whatever the company did, he would make money from it. But he also got paid direct royalties on the products that he made. Again, he was mad at paying royalties to Dave Arneson for stuff, but he was more than happy to take royalties on the stuff that he wrote. So not only is he an owner of the company, but he's also making royalties. And throughout the podcast, and understand this is all from the perspective of this one podcast. There's certainly other elements that are probably not in the podcast or other ways of looking at it. My understanding though is it feels like it's pretty accurate, and other people have said it's pretty accurate, that the fact that he got royalties was actually a problem because the company was literally in debt to Gary Gygax to pay him royalties. They were deferring on royalty payments because they couldn't afford it because it was so much, right? Then he also would basically his entire lifestyle, he eventually moved out to California to Hollywood. And there's a whole section about his time in Hollywood and all the crazy scandalous stuff that went on in Hollywood. And that's where it really gets like super tabloid, super kind of scuzzy stuff about, what he did. But it's all first-hand accounts, right? And he would submit his lifestyle as business expenses, including a $40,000 a month, $40,000 a month in today's dollars, $40,000 a month for the mansion that he was renting, which he claimed he needed in order to woo Hollywood people to be able to make movies and do TV shows, which really didn't come about, right? So he had a huge budget. He had company cars and his own staff, that all of the expenses for that were paid by the company, right? And then he wanted to claim all rights to all of the IP for Dungeons and Dragons that he would own personally, not TSR. So he claimed and tried to make claims that he owned all of the IP, when it turned out years earlier he had signed a thing saying, no, all of the IP that I created owned, and all of the IP written by anybody working at TSR belongs to TSR, which is still a policy that exists to this day with Wizards of the Coast. So so he was claiming that he owned the IP and he could just take the D&D stuff, all of his material that he wrote and all of the branding and trademarks, and walk away with it from TSR. So that's what I mean, like him triple or quadruple dipping into the company. And this is before they kicked him out, and we haven't gotten to that part of the podcast where obviously we all know, or anybody that's looked into it knows that eventually Gary Guy got kicked out of his own company. And you really felt like, oh man, how could the guy get kicked out of his own company? It was like, well, when you're quadruple dipping into your company, like you can understand when things didn't go good. So that was really interesting. So another lesson, and this is a lesson that I think we all take in many different ways, and I know there's been lots of talk on EN World about, I've seen it on EN World, but apparently it's been big on X. I don't partake in X anymore, so I wouldn't know about the D&D, the new D&D history book that Wizards of the Coast put out. Great big $100 history book, which I want, but I'm probably going to get it later this year. I'm going to get asked for like Christmas or something like that because it looks really good. And that book says things like, by the way, there's lots of problematic things in here from the time. It wasn't right then. It's not right now. And people are very upset. Oh, how dare you say that like the creators of this game had any kind of like racial biases? They were just people of their time. And then Ben Riggs actually wrote a whole thing being like, here's all the things he directly said. And they're all pretty terrible things, right? And one of the things that we have to keep in mind, that I try to keep in mind, you can make your own choices with your life. I'm not the boss of you. I'm not your dad or your priest. But like, one of the things I try to keep in mind is like, we can like the work of somebody and recognize the impact it had without removing the fact of the problems that they had as human beings, right? H.P. Lovecraft was a terrible, terrible racist, not just for the time. He was like directly a racist. And yet Call of Cthulhu and the Cthulhu mythos and everything like that has changed a lot of fiction, and his kind of writing has changed a lot of like horror fantasy and horror science fiction stuff for all time. Those two things can both be true. One does not balance out the other, right? You don't have to say like, oh, well, how good is it compared to how bad of the stuff that he did, right? Both of these things can be true. Gary Gygax could have been a very flawed individual with some very bad takes in the world and still have created Dungeons and Dragons, and that could still be a big impact on our lives. These things are true. It makes, people are complicated. We are complicated. And for us to be able to hold these two views, as Cory Doctorow refers to this, two views in superposition, right? That we have two things that can both be true. And I think that that's something that this podcast can show us as well, as we can see the deeply flawed nature of not just like of Gygax and everything, but also of like TSR management overall and the infighting and all of the kind of politics that went on, and terrible, really funny. Like some of the business decisions were just hysterical, and it's just super entertaining. All of these things can be true, and we can still love D&D. That's kind of my point. We can still love the work of flawed creators, recognizing that the work has value. And that the work can change things, even if the creator of it is flawed. And in these days, more and more, we kind of hear about, people who deservedly so are, it's referred to as cancel culture. You know what cancel culture is? It's also like, responsibility, right? Responsibility for your actions. And people can say and do terrible things, and yet the work that they created can also be valuable and important at the same time. And that's hard to deal with. I'm still struggling with figuring out how to deal with it. But this podcast is one way that really got me to think about this kind of thing. And it helps that all of this is sort of ancient history, and that we're not dealing with people who are still around today. And like, are we directly supporting them with the money that we spend or the energy that we spend? That's kind of a different topic and not one for discussion here, but it helps that that a lot of this is kind of ancient history, ancient as in 30 years ago history. And we can look at the D&D that's around today. We can look at the role-playing games that are around today and separate them from some of the problematic stuff that occurred when it was first getting made. But I think that the When We Were Wizards podcast is excellent, and I highly recommend it. Nimble 5e is a new Backerkit project. It's only been going on for a few days now. It's got 1,800 backers, and it is the second version of a set of rules to kind of streamline 5e. And what I recommend, I'm going to give you my recommendation right up front. You can download almost one click. It's close enough to one click that I think it's one click. A downloadable version of the sample pages. Free preview. Click the image below for a free preview. It goes to your Dropbox, and you can download it without even signing up. It says, "Oh, you should sign up." I'm like, no, I'm not interested in signing up. And that's for Dropbox. And then you can get the free preview version of it. I would recommend taking a look at the free preview. Read the Backerkit page, read the free preview, and see if it's the kind of version of 5e or style of 5e that excites you. One of the things I like about Nimble 5e is it hits this definition of an opinionated version of 5e. It hits this, it's a very clear take on what they want 5e to be like. And some major shifts. Like one is they clearly like, and I think they even bring it up in the book, they clearly like the 3 action system from Pathfinder 2. The idea that you can take 3 actions, one of those can be a move if you want. You can do other things with your actions. They really like that idea, and they wanted to bring it here. I think they mentioned that they weren't a super fan of the rest of the super tactical nature of Pathfinder 2, which is why they bothered to kind of bring that to 5e. I myself, as an example, and they're like whether or not somebody's opinion matches my opinion, I'm not a big fan of the 3 action economy. I would rather have an action and a move, and I'd rather get rid of bonus actions. Right? I would rather simplify it even further and say you get to do one big thing. But I didn't make it. So lots of other people, however, really love the 3 action economy of Pathfinder 2. So that's something to do. Another one is like you don't have to roll attack rolls. Instead, you roll damage and you have damage resistance. This is something else we've seen. I think the Critical Role RPG does this too, where you sort of have like a damage threshold that you have to beat based on your damage dice. So, faster attacking and things like that. Lots of different approach, like how combat works, some actions that you can do that are in combination with other characters. So it's not super tactical, but it's definitely got more like, hey, what are the things that you can do when you're running? Some of the things that you can do while you're running in combat. Turn order is interesting. Like instead of rolling for initiative, you basically say like whoever's ready to go goes, and then you go around the table clockwise. And then the GM can choose where the monsters go, either in or leaving between turns or having them go at the end of a round or whatever, which felt a little loose to me, right? Like I get the understanding of like, let's just get into it. Like let's have turn order basically follow how the story is playing out instead of rolling initiative. I get it, but I also think it's a little, I think it could feel arbitrary. I don't know, I haven't run it, but I think it could feel arbitrary to players that the DM can basically go whenever they want. I like it, but I can understand why that felt a little loose. Same with the idea that you have sort of a primary die when if you're rolling a die, if you're rolling multiple dice for an attack roll, the leftmost die is your primary die, and if that one rolls max, then it's a crit, and then crits expand and stuff like that. I thought that's a little interesting, the idea like the position of your dice matter. It's an interesting idea. It felt a little loose to me, but because like, oh, what if one of them is? What if I look at it from an angle? Like I can change which one is the primary die. So that's kind of interesting. I like very much. So I got a lot of people are like, how come you never talked about DC 20, right? The DC 20 RPG, huge RPG with tons and tons of attention applied to it, huge marketing budget that they spent on it. And a lot of people are like, how come you never talked about it? And it was like for 2 reasons. One was, it wasn't really for me. And I don't really want to bring up an RPG where I'm just going to talk about how it's not for me. And 2 is they didn't need my help. Right. One of the reasons why I bring up projects on this show is to help bring attention to those products. It was clear to me there was no need to bring any further attention to DC-20. Everybody was talking about it. It was advertised all over the place. And I felt like it's doing just fine without me. And I don't really have anything to say about it because it's not really the kind of game that I want to play. And one of the main reasons is this isn't 5e compatible. why am I talking about Nimble 5e? Is because it is 5e compatible. And I think that's interesting. That means that when we look at this, and I did order myself the PDFs of it. I was given from the creator a more up-to-date version of it, like the current beta rules for it, to dig in further. But I did back it myself with my own money to see what it's like. And part of the reason is when something is 5e compatible, I know that I'm more likely to be able to steal ideas from it and bring it into my game. An example was I didn't spend a lot of time looking at the character creation side of it, but I liked some of the things that they did with monsters. First of all, I really like that monsters are streamlined. In fact, this one, so monster stat blocks are very, very small. And I love that idea. I really, this is something from Forge of Foes. I really feel like I've gotten to the point now where I can run an effective 5e RPG with just a one-line stat block that I pull out of Forge of Foes, plus some improvisation of my own. I feel like that, and I've run that now in a few games, and my players can't even tell that I'm really doing it, which is pretty great. I really feel like we can make smaller stat block for monsters, and you can see here, like the Goblin, hit point 15, Scimitar, 2 attacks, Shifty can move 50 feet after an attack. Super straightforward, super easy to use. I like that a lot. And it also has this idea for legendary monsters, which basically can do things in between each turn. So they have more hit points, armor and saves, legendary resistance, can on use, Grimback skips her next turn. So they have legendary resistance, they can skip a turn and get rid of an effect. That's pretty interesting. And then they can act basically in between other people's turns by doing these things. After each hero, choose one. You can move, you can attack, you can screech one time, I think that's a pretty cool idea. I was talking to one of my players about the idea of having monsters act in between the turns of the characters. And he was like, well, wouldn't that mean that in some cases it's just better if I wasn't even there? Like if I'm not super effective, if I'm casting, because I was saying like, what if you cast Hold Person on somebody and they would basically skip their next turn instead of being completely held? And he's like, you know what else I could do? Not be there. And then it would skip their next turn. And I thought that was an interesting idea. Like when a monster scales to the number of players, the players might get to the point where they're like, I would rather I wasn't even here, and the monster would be less effective than if I was here, but I was missing my attacks, right? And I thought that was kind of an interesting thought, that maybe that's a reason why not to have a monster that can act on every character's turn, is because you might get to the point where a player might feel like I would have been more effective had I not played than if I did play, because it made the monster stronger. So that's an interesting thought. But really great artwork, really, really good looking book. I dig it, and I think that there's probably lots of ideas in here that we might be able to take. And I particularly love that this is a very, very opinionated take on 5e, very different from what you would see from any of the other 5e variants, and yet is still fully compatible with 5e. I really dig that idea. Check out the Nimble 5e Backerkit pledge going on right now. There is a link in the show notes. Take a look at it, listen to the video, check out the preview, and see if it's the kind of RPG that you want. And if it is, go ahead and back them. Now's a great time. Next week, I am launching the City of Arches Kickstarter. You can find a link to be notified of the Kickstarter below. Today, I am going to look at one of the things you can get in the sample chapters, in the sample pages, 42-page sample that's coming out. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is the short adventure that is included in this 42-page sample that you can get for free when you are notified and when you go to the Kickstarter after launch, called The Obsidian Skull. So the Obsidian Skull is a short first-level adventure. You could probably run it in a couple of hours pretty tightly. You could run it independently of everything else. You can just have it be its own independent adventure, or you can tie it directly to the introduction scenario for the City of Arches called Golgoroth Arises. Golgoroth Arises is sort of my favorite way to sort of introduce the City of Arches to the characters. I did a whole other video about Golgoroth Rises, so I'm not going to talk about that. But the end of Golgoroth Rises, the idea is an evil cultist tried to stop Garland Willemane from welcoming this new entity into the City of Arches, and is trying to remind him, hey, you're this super powerful devil, you should come join us, or you know, be who you are, be the true devil that you are. And you can sort of follow the trail of this cultist back to this cult that's doing stuff in the Crypts of the Dead. So that is all tied to this first level adventure at the end. It is one of several adventures that are going to be included in the main book. It's very quick kind of first level adventure that is available in the sample pages. So the Obsidian Skull begins when the characters are given a job. In this case, the job can be given by pretty much anybody, but Rosalind Zesh, the spy master to the Queen, is a major quest driver, one of the main quest NPCs in the City of Arches. I find her to be a really, really solid quest NPC. She's lots of fun. She's super smart. She's, a spy master, so she's kind of shifty, but it's really sort of fun. And she basically says, hey, look, I know there is a weird cult that is doing something back in the tombs of the crypts of the dead. And I would like to send you, I have sent somebody there to try to find out what's going on. And that person is Quintus Harotos, a halfling spy who infiltrated the cult and made their way into the area, but has now not been heard from. So she's like, hey, I could use a group to go in there and get my man out and figure out what the hell is going on with this cult. The cult is actually the Children of Abraxas. The Children of Abraxas are one of like two major cults. There's obviously as many cults as you want in the City of Arches because I love cultists, but they are one of two cult groups that operate in the City of Arches. The Children of Abraxas, the other main one being the Knights of the Nameless King. The Children of Abraxas are following a leader who believes that he is from this alien abyssal world called Abraxas and is trying to open up a permanent gateway, a big permanent gateway between Abraxas and the City of Arches so that he can flood the City of Arches with all of the demons that exist in Abraxas, including the demon prince who rules over Abraxas. A demon prince named Chul, who rules over the cursed abyssal realm of Abraxas. Anyway, they are more of the chaotic side of the cultists. And one of them is the one who tried to bring Golgaron, a horned devil, over to their side. So meanwhile, what is going on in this place is that cultists of the Children of Abraxas have found an old crypt beneath or behind a more recent crypt, or an old chamber behind another crypt, where they found a gateway to the world of Abraxas and are attempting to open it. And they actually are managed to open it. It's a small portal though, so luckily it's not going to overtake the entire city if it opens up. But it's a way to kind of see what is going on. So the theme of the adventure is that the characters are going into this tomb to stop the Children of Abraxas from doing whatever they're doing and rescue Quintus Harotos. It is a short sort of 3-room dungeon. So here's an example of the map. There is a crypt itself, then there is a set of like ruined caves, and then there's the hidden chamber behind it. And the hidden chamber is kind of where all of the main stuff is going on. Now, I ran this adventure for my home group just recently, and I made a couple of changes to it. One is that I wanted to tie this adventure into some larger stuff. So I had the tomb that you enter is actually tied to the family of the Summervines, because there is an adventure toolkit as part of the City of Arches that will be available in the main book called The Secrets of Summervine Villa. And I said that the Summervine family used to be known as the Gustav family, and the Gustav family had a tomb here. So that means that the Summervines might have actually been connected to the cultist who went into the Gustav tomb to go behind the wall. So I just put a little hint in there. And that's just an example of the hint that I put in. You can put in whatever hints you want, depending on the kind of campaign that's going on. So I highly recommend customizing little hints about what, drop in little seeds that can fuel people's adventures in the future. The other one is I had a player join us in the middle of this group. He wasn't available for session 0, where we did Golgaron Arises, but he did show up for session 1. And I said, wouldn't it be interesting if his character replaced Quintus Harotos? So instead of having a spy NPC, it was actually one of the characters that they ran into. And that way there was a way to kind of introduce a new character into the group and have this character tied to Rosalind Zesh, because they worked for Rosalind Zesh, which is why they came in. That actually worked rather well. So the dungeon itself is a very straightforward sort of approach. You walk into area 1, there's some curtains, and on the other side of the curtains are 2 cultists that are torturing, they're getting ready to kind of like sacrifice and hardly questioning Quintus Harotos to find out information. The characters can, of course, stop this and free Quintus Harotos, who then gives some information to the characters about what's been going on. The fact that the cultists of the Children of Abraxas found an obsidian skull in a hidden chamber and a lost cisterns beneath the City of Arches. So another adventure location they can go to find out how they got that and what else is going on there, along with scrolls detailing a ritual to open the archway. The leader of the branch, Urvana Spellstar, determined that this tomb is the location of the archway. So they found a key to an arch, and they found the arch, and they found the ritual to use the key key to open up the gateway, which is a common pattern for the arches in the City of Arches, that the arches are largely dormant. Sometimes somebody will come through from one side sort of randomly, but there are keys that can open up arches. And really, the whole arches and the whole keys are vehicles for the GMs to be able to steer the adventure wherever they want. There's no hardened mechanics for them. So you could have multiple keys can open up one archway to multiple different places, for example. You could have an archway that is permanently open. There are a couple of archways that are permanently open. They're always there. Just everybody generally leaves them alone. And lots of times stuff doesn't pop out the other side. There could be, like, finding a key could be a really long quest to open up a big archway that goes to someplace important. Or you could find keys that can open up simple archways. You could also have keys that only work once or only work twice. Maybe one key works when you go in and then back out, but then it doesn't work anymore. So it's a really good dial and a gauge. And this is some of the advice that I offer in the book, where I describe, like, how does this work as a story element when you're running your games in the City of Arches, is you get to decide what keys open up what arches and things like that. In this case, it is like a key that requires a ritual to open an archway, but it's not going to be permanent no matter what is going on, but they're bringing bad things through. Room 1, you find out about the cultists and you rescue Quintus Harutos. Room 2, you go through the catacombs on the other side. There is a crossbow trap. There is some stuff to kind of explore. There are elements of history that the characters can pick up in this chamber. So this is all in this longer hall here. And of course, if you wanted to, you could throw some monsters. Hey, you want to have some giant rats? Throw some giant rats, right? That can certainly work. I think I threw some gray oozes in here just to kind of, I was making a longer adventure out of it. So I threw some gray oozes in this area. But you can run it without any oozes at all, and it'll certainly run faster. That's another element you'll find to the adventures that are right for the City of Arches. My intention is that you will have dials that you can turn to either slow down or speed up adventures depending on how long you want them to be and what the pacing of the adventure feels like. There's a crossroad trap at the end of the hall, which the Children of Abraxas set up, and then you get into the chamber itself. And this is a kind of a nice big boss fight for a first level group. You have a cult fanatic and you have some cultists. Some bad things happen depending on what rounds are going on. And again, you have flexibility in changing these things as they go. But essentially, like round 1, that they have a grim chanting that they're hearing, that the portal is going active, and that the cultists have advantage on attack rolls and saving throws while this chant is going on. In round 2, a huge yellow eye peers out of the shadow swirling in the arch. Before initiative count 20 on the next turn, each creature who starts their turn within 30 feet of the arch, including Irvana and the cultists, must succeed on a DC 10 charisma saving throw or take 4 psychic damage. The cultists are compelled to behold the eye, so they take the damage because they're like, oh, look, they have to look at it. But the players can avert their eyes. If they avert their eyes until the end of the next turn, they have disadvantage and they're treated as though they are blind. And then round 3, Dretch comes forth. I actually kind of beefed up the Dretch a little bit. You could have multiple Dretches as you want, depending on how you feel about it. I used the Dretch stat block, but gave them more hit points because we had more than 4 characters. And they defeated the Dretch. I think I also had the Dretch, like devour the cultists or kill Irvana themselves and stuff like that. And then the characters defeated the Dretch, the portal went dormant, they had the Obsidian Skull, and now what do they do with it? Do they bring the Obsidian Skull back to Rosalind Zesh? Do they destroy it? Do they try to sell it to a shady fence? Do they further investigate where the skull came from? And this starts a whole line of investigation that can go into one of the major campaign arcs, which you can find in the sample chapter called The Key of Worlds. And the whole idea behind the Key of Worlds is that the Children of Abraxas are trying to find one key that can open up the largest gateway or any of the gateways in the City of Arches to whatever realms they want to go to. It is a 1st to 20th level campaign you can follow. It's the one that I'm using. I'm actually mixing this campaign arc with another one of the campaign arcs in the book called The Rise of the Nameless King. I am shuffling the 2 of these together so that nice, fun complications, lots of options for characters and what they want to do, and 2 different storylines, 2 different groups that are both doing these things. It's lots of fun. But you can find an example of the campaign arc for the Key of Worlds inside the sample chapters as well, and see how it connects to the arrival of Gorgoron, the Obsidian Skull, and so on. So that's the example of the Obsidian Skull. So this is an example of the kind of adventure you can find in the City of Arches sourcebook. This adventure itself is in the sample chapters for the Kickstarter, so you can find it there. You can, when you have the sample chapters in hand, you can run those scenarios yourself, see how it plays out, and hopefully enjoy it as much as many other GMs and many other groups who have enjoyed it in the past. and I'm really excited about it. If you like it, please consider backing the City of Arches sourcebook. You will not be disappointed. I am super excited about this book. I really love it. I'm running it myself, and I really love it. I wish I had the final book in my hand. I am running with the current draft, which is awesome, but boy, I wish I had the full version in my hand when I was running it. But it's really, really fun. And I think you're really going to love it. So please consider supporting my Kickstarter. It's the best way that you can support the work that I do. You can find a link in the show notes. Thank you so much. This past weekend, I had a really unique opportunity to play a bunch of different role-playing games, including Pirate Borg, Blade Runner, and Dragonbane. These are all 3 RPGs that I wanted. I also played Shadowdark, and I also played 5e, but I've talked so much about Shadowdark and 5e, I don't really need to talk about those here. And I really liked these RPGs. Pirate Borg was really fun. Pirate Borg is a version of Mork Borg, very simple rules, very straightforward, really excellent production values. The creators of Pirate Borg were very kind to send me a review copy of the physical books. The physical construction of Pirate Borg is really, really excellent. It's a beautiful book, really, really cool stuff. All the kind of cool tables and everything that you can find in it. Excellent artwork, far more legible than the original Mork Borg, I will say. And I was definitely eager to run it. It has kind of a very interesting setting where it is set in our world, probably in like the 1800-ish time frame, where you are pirates that are between sort of 3 different empires: the corrupt British Empire, the corrupt French Empire, and hordes of undead. And you're kind of surviving through all of these different things. I'm not normally a big fan of running games that are set in our world because it's very easy to kind of stereotype things that are going on in our world. But I think that Pirate Borg could really lend itself to a fun campaign or short set of adventures where you are pirates that are trying to, you're punching up. So you're pirates that are dealing with the corrupt British Empire, the corrupt French Empire, and the undead, trying to protect those. You're not like heroes. You're still pirates. You're still engaged in piracy and things like that, but are trying to protect those who need protection. I like to think of it like if I was going to run a campaign in Pirate Borg, I would run it like the A-Team. Like everyone's after you all the time. Everyone kind of thinks you're bad, except the people that you're actually helping, right? And the people that you're helping recognize that you're helping people. That wasn't how our adventure played out when I was playing Pirate Borg at the convention. In that case, in our adventure, to make it really quick, we were our ship was in the doldrums. Our characters were introduced as being a part of this ship, and we were stuck, and we were all starving to death, and going to die to exposure and lack of water. And a sea hag, we didn't know she was a sea hag at the time, but a sea hag said, "I can save you from this. But in order to do so, you have to go to this temple on this island and take this artifact and bring it to me." And we said, hell yeah, that sounds great, right? Like, of course, it's better than dying. Like, there wasn't really much of a choice. Like, oh yeah, it's that or starve. Sure, we'll go steal an artifact from a temple. That sounds cool. So she's like, bang. And she sends our ship to the island, where we find out there's a native populace there, and they're happy, and they are isolated from all of the other horrors of the world. So the British Empire hasn't screwed with them, the French Empire hasn't screwed with them, the undead haven't screwed with them. They are also shapeshifters that can shapeshift into tigers and stuff, but otherwise seem totally like nice people, except they're isolated. They don't want us there. So 4 of our characters were like, "Oh, can we help you?" And they're like, "No, get on your boat and leave." And 2 of our characters, including mine, broke into their temple, stole their holy war club, and left. And when we did, the whole island was destroyed, and everybody on it was destroyed except for us on our boat as we sailed off with their holy artifact to give it to this evil hag. And I remember my friend and I, who were playing, both looked at each other and goes, "Are we the baddies?" And we're like, "I'm pretty sure we're the baddies." Like, "Oh yeah, we were the baddies. We just killed an entire native population in order to steal this war club," right? And we're like, "Huh," right? That was funny. So then I played Blade Runner, and Blade Runner uses the same kind of mechanics. I think that like the Alien RPG does. Free League runs it, I think it's Free League, right? And Blade Runner was another one where we had this really interesting moral quandary that we were investigating. So we were part of the Blade Runner group. We were investigating a reporter who was anti-replicant, who had been shot by 2 people, and they thought there might be a replicant reason for it. And it turned out one of the 2 people who shot him was a replicant. And then there were our characters. And my character was a guy who fought side by side with replicants and liked them. My wife's character was a replicant. And then we had other people who were sort of anti-replicant for one reason or another. And I think that the game leans into this idea of like the moral issues of like, are you on the side of replicants and are you not? My issue with that is that right from the very get-go, if you go and watch the original version of Blade Runner, they make it very clear that replicants are essentially another way of talking about race. And that, and then the people's approach towards replicants is basically the same as like the people's approach of racism in our world. And when you have characters who are like, well, some of them are racist and some of them aren't, that is certainly something you want to talk about before you start running the game. Because we actually had situations where like one of the replicant was hung. And I'm like, wow, that is a terrible metaphor, right? That is a terrible bit of imagery to put, because something we did got a replicant caught by an anti-replicant league who then hung them. And I'm like, whoa, that is a problematic image if I ever saw one. And so that was really an issue. And then I played Dragonbane. There was no moral issues with Dragonbane. We went to there was a tower that's sinking underneath the water, and we had to deal with a bunch of puzzles in order to go through the tower and I think collect some kind of pearl or something at the top of it. And we got out. So it was really, I should have said hanged. The replicant was hanged. So Dragonbane, the story of Dragonbane went really fine. I liked the mechanics of all three games. I actually, and I think that there's a really fun way that you could play Morkborg, essentially by playing, the way I would do it is by playing it like the A-Team. I didn't like Blade Runner. And one of my issues with Blade Runner is because it's not problematic itself, but it can very easily lead to such problematic situations. And one of the things I think about with Blade Runner as a story is that both of the big Blade Runner movies are about one character coming to grips with their own views of humanity. And I don't know how you do that in a group situation with everybody's got different backgrounds. I talked to my friend Teos, who's been running a long-term Blade Runner campaign, and he says he's been having a really good time with it and that all of those stories have been interesting. But he also recognizes that, like, in a mixed group, and especially in like a one-shot game with strangers at a con, it could be a real problem. And that really comes to this topic of how we deal with morality in role-playing games. Now, I am certainly not saying that there needs to be like one general rule about how you deal with morality in role-playing games, but I definitely think it is worth the time and energy for groups to talk about the expectations of how we're going to handle morality in the role-playing games that we run. So you could, for example, say, hey, all of us are happy just really being pirates playing Pirate Borg. Like, we are the baddies, and that's going to be okay. And if you and your group are all on board with that, and everyone has made it clear like how that's going to work. And I would still say you probably want to have some safety tools in there to say, hey, look, okay, this is where I draw the line and I'm not comfortable with this. And maybe the two safety tools that I really like when I'm running role-playing games are some kind of X card. I use a thing called pause for a minute, where I say anytime anybody says pause for a minute, you stop, you break character, and you talk as players about what's going on. And you can say, I would really rather not do X, Y, or Z. I think a GM can do a lot of good by, if they think that there's a situation, saying, let's pause for a minute. Is everybody okay if we do this thing? Anybody not, are you guys all good with it? And if they say, yeah, you go, okay, game on, we're back in, right? And then the other one is lines and veils, where you say, even if you're running a pirate game where you're a bunch of evil pirates doing evil pirate stuff, you probably want to have some lines about, like, we're not going to do stuff, like, we're not going to murder children, or we're not going to do this stuff, or we're not going to do that stuff. You can still have some hard lines about what you're going to do. And you could have veiled stuff of like, okay, well, we're not going to delve into the details of torture. We're going to veil that, but we still have it, but we veil it. So you can still have lines and veils. I think that it definitely behooves groups where morality is a question in the game to have those tools. I think every game should have those tools in place. You can disagree. If you don't want them, you don't have to have them. I know in games I want to run, I would really prefer to have them. They don't take any effort to put in there, and they can really help steer the game in a fun direction. It's not just about, people are oversensitive and we have to worry about it. No, it's also about making sure the game we're playing is fun, and that we like where we're going, and we understand where we're going. And I think that's where the topic of morality in role-playing games matters, is having this baseline understanding of why the game and how the game is operating. And it's why I really like the idea that when you come to the agreement about it, you have a bond that the characters share that follows along the lines of the morality of the game that you're following, which is like, we are all heroes that are here to protect the people of the city of Arches from evildoers who would try to harm the city. right? You know you're not just bad guys. You could change that to, we are dungeon delvers who are seeking the greatest treasures we can from the ripe plunders of the City of Arches. If you and your group are on board with that, that can be the theme of your adventure, and you can define it up front. So I think that the main thing when I think about morality in role-playing games is defining that idea that if you are going to play Blade Runner, you can say things like, and again, sort of like the stage, the expectations are like, this is how you are, the behavior and how you're going to treat and be treated by and as replicants. And here are some lines and veils that we don't want to cross because it's just ugly. Like, we don't want the game to just go in ugly areas. And you could say, like, having us all deal with our own connections to replicants, both good or bad, is something we're individually going to find out. But that could mean that we're going to have inter-party conflict. Are you guys okay with that? Right? And if everybody says, yeah, that could be part of the fun of the game, then you're like, okay, that's great. But if you're like, no, I'd really rather the group is working together, then maybe you need to shift things around so that it's clear that the general moral take of the characters are in the same way. So I think it is worth thinking about when you're building your campaign, particularly if you're a GM and you have an idea of like, what are the moral sort of boundaries that you expect for how the game is going to go, how the characters are going to behave to each other, to the world, to the story of the adventure. You need to communicate that. You need to tell the players what is going on, or you need to discuss it with your players during your session 0 to make sure that everybody's on board with the direction. If you are expanding the borders of the morality so you can have evil characters and good characters together, you want to explain how that's going to work so that the game doesn't just evolve into players getting pissed off or sad or bummed out or hurt. That is an important thing to talk about. And it was really clear to me because we were playing these one-shot games where, there were safety tools in operation. You were X cards if you want to do anything. Nobody hit them, but we were all like, what should we be doing? Like, it wasn't ever clear to us when we played Pirate Borg. Given the kind of characters we had made, we said, well, we wouldn't have a problem destroying this native civilization, and we did. But afterwards, we're like, was that really what we wanted to do? Like it was never... I think a conversation could have happened of like, you guys are pirates, you get to decide. Like, even telling us, hey, there's going to be a moral question aside, and you guys want to decide whether or not you're going to be, on what side of it you're going to be. I suggest you do that as a group so that you don't have a bunch of intergroup conflict over whether or not you're going to decide one way or the other. I think that could be really worthwhile. So it made me think about it a lot. I don't have any hard rules for any of this, other than to say it's certainly something you want to talk about with your group. And I think having some fundamental tools in place, like an X card, like a let's pause for a minute, like lines and veils, takes hardly any work and definitely makes games head off into a better direction than if you just leave it to the Wild West and everybody is doing whatever they want to do, and then players are shooting, characters are killing each other, and other players are really pissed off, and other players are like, man, did you realize what you just did? I think there's lots of problems that can be short-circuited early, that can be dealt with early when we talk to our players, we have a session 0, and we have some basic understanding of what the moral directions are about the game that we're going to be playing in. Every month on the Sly Flourish Patreon, we have a monthly Q&A. It is a thread where anybody can ask any RPG-related question. I answer all the questions every Friday morning on the Patreon. Sometimes I take those questions and I bring them here to the talk show so we can dive into them deeper. Today's question is from Danito. You have been talking about your gripes with some of the newer WotC D&D adventures having story development that risk the trust between players and GM. Since I find the topic really interesting, I would like you to talk about player trust in general, how to earn it, how to maintain it, what kinds of things to avoid and not risk it. I struggle a lot to get my players to trust NPCs, not even the ones that might have a hidden agenda, but NPCs that are supposed to be benevolent and allies of the party. No, Runara is not brainwashing the kobolds and Dragon's Rest to do her bidding. Most often, in cases like this, I resort to straight up telling my players that the characters feel like they can trust the NPC, or let them make an insight roll, but I would like to hear if you have any other tips on how to handle and even avoid such misconceptions. Yeah, so player trust... There's a couple of elements, and there's like trusting NPCs and there's trusting the game master. And it's very easy for us to get into a situation where the players don't trust the game master because we keep pulling the rug out from underneath them. One thing I think is really critical about NPCs is recognizing that the NPCs have their own goals and agendas, and that we can, as much as we can, expose those goals and agendas to the players so they understand what the risks are of dealing with certain NPCs. I think you're absolutely right. We can't just tell them, right? No, trust me. And this is where you have to totally base it. Like, trust me, you looking at this character, you recognize that they are good and they are on board and they are not trying to betray you. I think it's totally fine to just tell people that that's the case. I don't think, especially if you have a group that's just suspicious of everybody. One question I have is why they would be. Why are they suspicious of every NPC they run into? But you don't even have to have them roll an insight check. Sometimes you can just say, you know that this one's a good one. But I don't mind even characters that are shady from having their shadiness on their sleeve. I think it's far more interesting to have players dealing with NPCs, which could also be like intelligent magic items, when they know they can't really trust the NPC, but they know that for now they're aligned in the right path. I do it with magic items all the time. But you can certainly do it with NPCs as well. They're like, yeah, this person's definitely shady. I don't think they're going to turn on us. Like, they're not just going to send us into a pit full of vipers, because what value is that? But they might have their own reasons for why they want us to work with them to do this thing. Where I think it really falls apart, and this is going to spoil Vecna Eve of Ruin. So if you are playing in Vecna Eve of Ruin and you don't want to be this spoiled, you can probably skip to the end of the show, because I think this is all I'm going to talk about. In some of the WotC adventures that have come out recently, particularly Vecna Eve of Ruin, not only do they have like an NPC who's got like a different agenda, they are just strictly working directly against the players, and yet the players are supposed to think they're working in line with them. It is 180 degree opposite of what you want from the NPC. And even worse is not just the trust in the NPC being broken, but the adventure, that adventure in particular, puts a whole ton of mechanical elements in place to make sure the players will never figure it out, including things like a crazy magic crown that makes them impossible to detect that they're actually somebody else, and including having the smartest NPCs say, no, you can trust them, even though you can't. There's all of these things where, to me, those are violations between the GM and the player. If the GMs are going out of their way to ensure that the players can never figure out that this NPC is going to betray them, only to betray them later, that's not an NPC betrayal, that's a GM betrayal. You're taking all of the tools away that the game has to be able to figure that out, right? That is a problem. So that's where I think trust can go bad. And I know, I think this is actually a pretty common thing that GMs do, is they think it'll be cool to surprise the players by having this NPC that they love turn out to be a bad guy. I think that's actually a really terrible plot element. And there's so many other cool, interesting things you can do other than that. So the first thing I would say, as far as how do you make sure to not break this trust, is don't do it. Don't have NPCs that they think are good guys actually be bad guys. Right? That's just not that. It's not as cool as you think it's going to be. Instead, have bad guys they have to work with anyway. Far more interesting. I know this person's a bad guy, but we're working in the right direction together. I know I have to watch them. I know they've got shady stuff going on, but I can still work with them because I know that. Far more interesting when they have to work with people that they know they can't trust than it is to take someone they do trust and break the trust. So that is probably the big thing I would do. The other one is, like, if you feel like they are being untrusting of an NPC they should trust, just tell them they can trust them. Again, break the fourth wall. And no, this person really doesn't have an agenda against you. They're on your side. Just tell them, especially if it's an important quest NPC. The other big part is always be thinking from the point of view of the NPC. What do they want? What is their goals? What are they trying to do? And then figure out how they react to whatever the characters are doing. So that's different than saying, like, instead of forcing any kind of betrayal in there, it means that sometimes the NPCs are going to act on their own interests rather than the interests of the characters, because it makes sense for the character, but the characters are probably going to know that that's going on. Now, if you're running published material where you see a betraying NPC, you can just change it. Now, it's harder to change in Vecna Eve of Ruin because it's so critical to the whole nature of the adventure, which I didn't even buy it. Like, I canceled my pre-order for it as soon as I read what was going on, because I was like, that's not the kind of adventure I want to run. But Light of Xeraxis, there's going to be a spoiler for Light of Xeraxis, the adventure that's part of the Spelljammer box set. Light of Xeraxis has an NPC that betrays you. It's far more interesting to take this betraying NPC and instead say they were overcome by the events of the situation, and it's up to the players or the characters to convince them that to stay on the right track, that they fall off the track, but the characters with the right persuasion can get them back on it again. Then there's a chance that it's not a betrayal, it's them convincing them of what's going on. That's actually how it played out. And it felt far less betrayal, because it wasn't like this NPC had this agenda they were going for the whole time that was a surprise to the players. It was they got caught up in the situation. They're heading in the wrong path, and it's up to the players to bring it back to the right path or end them. And that was a much more interesting choice to have. So my short, lazy advice is, like, stay in the head of your NPCs. First of all, don't have NPCs betray characters directly. Instead, have NPCs be clear to the players what they can do with these NPCs, including the ones that they can't necessarily trust, but need to work with anyway, because they're going to be skeptical anyway, and that can really work. Really excellent question. Friends, I want to thank everybody for hanging out with me today while we talked about all things in tabletop role-playing games. If you like this show and you want to help me out, the best thing you can do is sign up for the City of Arches sourcebook on Kickstarter. You can back the Kickstarter. This is the best way to support what I do. I do one of these about every 18 months. I'm super excited about this book. Please check it out. And of course, you can get the free sample chapter. You can also subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter. There is a link in the show notes to subscribe. It's absolutely free to sign up. You get a weekly newsletter sent directly to your inbox, along with a free adventure PDF. Free adventure generator PDF. You can also pick up any of my other books on the Sly Flourish bookstore. Links are in the show notes. And you can become a patron of Sly Flourish, getting access to the awesome Sly Flourish Lazy DM community over on Discord, helping support this show directly, and getting lots of awesome tips, tricks, adventures, and tools to help you run your game. Thank you all so much. Have a great day, and get out there and play a role-playing game.